So Victim Support Europe is actually an international network of both non-governmental and governmental organizations, as well as universities, research institutes, and even individuals who work or are interested in victim support. So having said that, we actually come from the perspective of cooperation of governments and civil society, and through almost 30 years of experience in providing support to victims of crimes in general, and then also victims of terrorism in particular, as this is the topic of today's event, we understand that without cooperation of governmental and non-governmental actors, adequate and complete support to victims of crime is actually impossible. And what that means is that while governments have their specific responsibilities and have specific approach to resolving things, and for example access to justice for victims of terrorism is impossible to imagine without a strong state apparatus and involvement of states, or in the first response the police, the crisis response in general is delivered by the state, but we see more and more the civil society is being involved also in crisis response, and we understand that there's a lot of room to actually involve civil society in terms of preparation and planning for terrorist attacks, in the crisis response, and in particular in long-term response and long-term provision to needs of victims, because civil society is usually more flexible in terms of where, how and when they provide services. They are more responsive. They can easily engage volunteers, which is more difficult for state actors, and a lot of victim support is actually being reliant on the work of volunteers. So there's actually many ways in which civil society can be and should be involved in the response to terrorist victimization. So the EU response to terrorist victimization is based on three main legal documents. The first one is the EU Victims Compensation Directive, then the EU Victims' Rights Directive, and finally the EU Counter-Terrorism Directive. But having understood that terrorist victimization is in essence a cross-border phenomenon, where we rarely have terrorist attacks that only involve nationals of one state, the EU is now looking into opening and establishing and supporting an EU coordination center for victims of terrorism. But the first step before the coordination center, they are actually now in the process of setting up a two-year EU Center of Expertise on Victims of Terrorism, which will actually look into providing some training tools, delivering training to professionals, and then finally also to look into the feasibility of setting up the EU Coordination Center for Victims of Terrorism. So that's down the road, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But the idea is really to actually have a coordinated EU response to terrorist attacks, understanding that not all countries are equally exposed to the danger and threat of terrorism, and understanding that, as I've said already, terrorist victimization has a significant cross-border component and requires international cooperation, so not just the EU but internationally. The Council of Europe is the source of human rights for 47 European member states and for millions of people in the 47 European member states. But what we need to do to support victims of terrorism and to respond to their needs is a rights-based but needs-driven approach. So what the Council of Europe should be doing, and we hope will be doing in the future, is considering needs of victims of terrorism in their policy response, in their legal response, having an approach that is taking into consideration all needs of victims of terrorism and then responding to those needs, and also working with governments to provide support in member states, encouraging and strengthening the response to victimization, making sure that no victim goes unsupported, and that all victims get the support they need for as long as they need it.